and welcome to There's Suffin About Suffolk, a podcast where we deep dive into the county of Suffolk. Here in episode 4, we're continuing with the Anglo-Saxons of Suffolk, and this week we're taking a trip to Weststow. Weststow is a small village and civil parish in West Suffolk, lying just north of Bury St Edmunds. Weststow Anglo-Saxon Village is an archaeological site and an open-air museum located near to there. I sat down with Alan Baxter, a heritage consultant who ran Weststow for nearly 30 years.
I moved to Weststow in 1985 to take charge at Weststow, and I stayed there till 2014.
Wow, I had no idea it was that old. I used to visit when I was younger.
Well, I am, or Weststow.
Weststow.
Well, the whole story of Weststow is that they actually found the cemetery first. And it links back to the Basil Brown story in a roundabout way, that in the 1800s, there weren't archaeologists. We call them antiquarians. They were often vicars who employed labourers, workmen, to go out and find interesting things in the ground. And when we found the notebooks of these vicars exist of paying Joe Bloggs 3p for finding a Saxon spearhead. Thank you very much, Joe. Here's your 3p. Off you go and find something else. And so in those days, they were very much interested in the objects that were found, not about the context of those objects. So at Weststow, on Weststow Heath in the 1860s, we've got divers urns and skeletons, that's what they wrote on the map at the time, were found on Weststow Heath. So they weren't interested in the layout or anything, just the fact that, oh, good, we've got some Saxon pots and we've got some skeletons and some grave goods in some of those skeletons. So they knew where the cemetery was, but they didn't know where the people lived who were buried in that cemetery. And so many years later, at the time of the Second World War, when Basil Brown was working at Ipswich Museum, he did little trial excavations in a number of places on Weststow Heath. And when he was digging there in the 1940s, after he dug at Sutton Hoo, he found bits and pieces of pottery and even a bit of a sunken featured building. And that told him that this was a good chance that this hill near the cemetery was where the Anglo-Saxon village was. And by good luck, one of the people who were helping him in the dig was a young lad called Stanley West, who was also working part-time at Ipswich Museum. And Stanley West was inspired by Basil Brown to a life of archaeology and got qualified and trained. And eventually, back in 1965, was asked to take over the excavations. So there's a direct link at Weststow between the 60s excavations and way back on Basil Brown.
Obviously, it's been there since the Anglo-Saxon period, but in terms of a sort of place you can visit, was it the 70s that it sort of started up?
Yes, that's right. In the Anglo-Saxon village was excavated by Stanley West between 1965 and 72. And then after the excavation, things just combined that a group of Cambridge students were interested in doing a reconstruction of an Anglo-Saxon house. And they contacted Stanley West, and they became the Weststow Environmental Archaeology Group. And they built the first house in 1973. And it was on Anglia TV, and we've got the archive footage. And that's when it all started, but the council took over and the Anglo-Saxon Village Trust soon after then.
Amazing. And so it really is based in reality. There really was a settlement there. Absolutely.
The post holes of many of the reconstructions, not all, but many of them, are in the same post holes that the original Anglo-Saxon, they're called sunken featured buildings, were in, and the hall also.
So we can really genuinely get an idea of how they used to live.
Yeah.
Incredible.
And I think it's also worth saying that I think you tend to judge people by the houses that they live in. And that may be a bad thing to do, but I think we all do it. And so originally the idea was these early Anglo-Saxons lived in holes in the ground. And so, if you think people lived in holes in the ground, that sums up your view of them. But Stanley West looked at the evidence here and came up with these different interpretations of the same archaeological evidence, which was a suspended floor above these pits that they found, and a much better house built around that.
Yeah. So what is the sort of structure? Are you able to describe it to us?
Yeah. Well, what the archaeologists find in these early, and I want to stress that, the Anglo-Saxon period really divides into sort of three areas: the early, the middle, and the late. And we're talking about the early Anglo-Saxon period that starts soon after the Romans left. We don't know exactly what date, but let's say about 420-ish AD, and goes on to around 625, 650 AD, which is the date of Sutton Hoo. So in this early period, the most distinctive form of building that you find are these sunken featured buildings, and the archaeologists find these pits in the ground, and sometimes they find post holes at either end of the pits. And originally, as I mentioned, it was thought that people lived in the pits, as they do in some places in the world. But the evidence at West Stow changed that idea, because Stanley West and his team found two burned buildings. And what happens is, you see, is all the wood normally just rots away when it's been in the ground for 1,500 years. But at West Stow, the burned timbers turned into charcoal, which was preserved. And that gave us what I like to call a Saxon sandwich, various layers. And the bottom layer of the sandwich was burned planks that had collapsed into the bottom of the pit. The middle layer of the sandwich were these weird round clay donut shaped things, which were loom weights. And then the top layer of the sandwich was another layer of burned planks. And the archaeologists interpreted that as the top layer of burned planks were the walls, which collapsed. The loom weights belonged to looms which stood on the lower layer of planks, which then also collapsed into the pit. So from those two burned houses, the archaeologists came up with a different idea, that maybe the Anglo-Saxons didn't live in the pit, but they lived on a raised floor above that pit, which made their living floor drier and warmer than it would otherwise have been. You've got to remember, if you want to make a sandcastle on the beach, if you want wet sand, you dig a pit, don't you? You dig a hole, and that's where you get your good sandcastle sand. So by definition, if the hole is going to be colder and wetter than the ordinary surface. So that's why, if you believe the Anglo-Saxons lived on these raised floors, I think it gives you a much more positive idea of what it was like to live as an Anglo-Saxon.
Definitely.
But these houses weren't the only buildings. There were like a cluster of houses found around a hall. And a hall is a different kind of building. It doesn't have a pit underneath it. The archaeologists find a rectangle of post holes, often with one or two gaps in that rectangle of post holes, which are normally interpreted as doorways. And also at West Stow, we found in the middle of the junction of these two possible doorways a patch of burned sand, which suggests that they had a central hearth in there. So the idea was that people lived in the houses, but came together for meetings and feasts in the hall, or used the hall, like in the Beowulf story, for emergency accommodation area for unexpected visitors. But here in East Anglia, we are part of the area dominated by the Angles, and it's quite interesting that one of the ways that the archaeologists know that this was Angle dominated was when they find the graves. It's the women in those graves which have a distinctive, let's call it a tribal costume. And in this part of the country, the women wear these things called sleeve clasps, which hold their sleeves together, which tells us, A, they had long sleeves rather than short sleeves, and B, that they had these specially made metal sleeve clasps, which they only have in Anglian areas. They don't have those in Saxon or Jutes areas. So we know that the Angles dominated. And where we are in East Anglia, Norfolk and Suffolk are Anglian dominated, but Essex, as we all know, are a completely different race. They are the East Saxons rather than the Angles, and they're dominated by the Saxon tribal members. But in all of these areas, there was very much of a mixture, and as time went by, the different tribes mixed and merged together. And we don't know how many of the original Romano-British people were living here, because you've got to remember the Anglo-Saxons are coming over pretty quick after the official end of Roman rule. They were here very, very quickly. So yes, different tribes. And the other thing to come back to Beowulf for these communities, not like our communities today, I don't think, much more hierarchical, in that there were people who were at the top and people who were at the bottom, and right at the bottom were slaves. There were various ways that you could become a slave in Anglo-Saxon times, a captive in battle or something like that. But a slave was somebody who was not free, somebody who had to work for other people and get very little in return for it. But the free Anglo-Saxons, it's interesting how we make these guesses, because that's what they are, based upon what the archaeologists find in the graves. So, for example, a slave is normally buried with nothing to go to the next world. Whereas archaeologists broadly think that if a man, for example, is buried with a spear, yes, that means he's sort of warrior class, but it also means he's a free man. The spear itself is a badge of his freedom. And equally with the women, they're buried with beads and pairs of brooches. And the richer women have these whacking great big bronze brooches worn in the middle of their chest. So you can see just by looking at the graves who are the better well off and who are the poorer well off. And then above these free people, you then get people who are buried, men who might be buried with a sword. And that is, again, it's not just a weapon, it's a symbol of their rank in society, and only noble men could carry a sword. So you see, it's a very hierarchical society, and very rigid in that sense. These people were buried normally with their Sunday best possessions and their symbols of their rank, to go to another world, a world where they had lots of feasting and enjoyed themselves. So they wanted to wear their Sunday best. But these people were laid in the ground east to west, the way that the sun rises and sets. And the houses in the Anglo-Saxon village are orientated east-west, so that then they get the maximum amount of sunshine on any given day. And we think that some of the people were buried and some of the people were cremated, depending on exactly which burial practice they followed. And at Weststow in the museum, there's a fascinating partly melted brooch, a woman's brooch, which is vital evidence for the fact that they cremated some of the people, because all that's left is ashes. And quite often the Anglo-Saxons made special, very highly decorated cremation pots to put these ashes inside. And these pots had lids on the top as well. And at one place, a place called Spong, they actually, which is very rare, found one of the lids off the pots. And on that lid, there's a great little pottery sculpture of a man sitting on a chair on top of this lid, which sits on the pots, which no doubt contained his ashes inside there. So the cemeteries are fascinating because there are objects buried with the people, which gives us a bit of a clue about their beliefs and this east-west orientation and the different ways that they thought about their afterlife. The fascinating thing about Suffolk is that in one county, we've got Sunhu, the famous one that you've mentioned, where the king or kings were buried there, just like in the Beowulf story, where the burial of a king is described. There they dragged up this enormous, great big rowing boat so they could bury him in special style, ready to go to the next world there. We have Sutton Hoo at one end of the county. We've got West Stow at the other end of the county, which tells us how the ordinary Anglo-Saxon people lived in this time. And also we've got Ipswich, Yipperswich, which is one of the very first Anglo-Saxon towns, we believe, because it's important to remember in this time, okay, the Romans had towns, but the early Anglo-Saxons lived in villages, small collections of houses spread normally up the rivers, because rivers are very important in Anglo-Saxon times. It's the way that people travel, it's where they get the water from, and many of the settlements are up these river valleys, because down in the river valleys the soils are easier to work, whereas up on the high tops, it's a bit of a laugh, isn't it, in Suffolk, the high tops, but on the higher ground, that's where you get the clay soils and the bigger trees, and it's more difficult to work the ground. So the early Anglo-Saxons lived in these easily worked areas up the river valleys. So the rivers are really important. And in Suffolk, we've got the ordinary people, we've got the kings, and also we've got the first towns. What a fantastic combination in one county.
So what can we then take? Do we know much about their sort of diet and lifestyle? Because if the ground is famously quite acidic here, were they able to sort of grow vegetables, or was it more sort of hunter-gatherer?
Yeah, you're asking all the questions that visitors to West Stow ask, so well done. But at least it shows you've thought about it, which is brilliant. The worst question I can ever remember was, well, could they talk? Because people have got a very, you said this is the Dark Ages. Quite often this was missed out with people's schooling, and people don't know where to place the Anglo-Saxons in the scheme of things. And so there are many surprises associated with the Anglo-Saxons. And it's worth just pointing out that the discoveries at Sutton Hoo at the time of the Second World War opened people's eyes as to the capabilities of these people. The amazing treasures that were found there were a big shock, a big surprise that people could really do things on this kind of quality level and draw in resources from all over the known world. And at West Stow, just a little bit later, Stanley West's work there, his experimental archaeology, rebuilding the village, is saying, well, hey, it's not just what they could make, it's the houses that they lived in. And again, in Suffolk, you put those two things together, and other more recent things like the Prittlewell discovery down in Essex, and you're talking about a much better picture of the Anglo-Saxons than we've ever had before, shedding light onto the so-called Dark Ages. But getting back to your question about how they lived, one of the other interesting things about this hierarchical society is obviously, as we've already touched on, the things that you find tend to be badges or symbols of the way that they lived. So the king's got all these things that are objects, but at the same time, very important symbols that he's buried with. And it's the same with the ordinary people at West Stow. But those symbols that they chose to be buried with also give us some clues about their daily life. But we get much more from excavating a site where they actually lived, like at West Stow. And the particular nature of the soil at West Stow is interesting because for some reason, the chemical nature of it, it has preserved bone and antler very well. Most sites preserve pottery. Pottery is almost indestructible. It's like, it lasts a long, long time in the soil. But the bone and antler were like the Anglo-Saxon plastic. They used it a lot. And we got many, many things at West Stow that were made out of bone and antler. When it's cleaned up, it's like white plastic to look at, but it's a material that we don't use much of these days. And at West Stow, it's famous. West Stow is famous for the number of combs found at West Stow. So, okay, what's the big deal about a comb? Well, to start with, these combs are not just a piece of material cut up to work like a comb. They're called composite. They're made out of antler, which is cut into sections and very carefully cut to make the teeth of the comb. And then on the top, holding these multiple sections of teeth together, is some bone, which has slightly different properties and binds all those elements together with iron rivets. And the idea of holding this comb together, that you spent hours and hours working on by whacking it with a hammer on an iron rivet, risking destroying the whole thing, just shows you what great craftsmen they were. So these combs, to start with, are fabulous objects. Be very difficult for anybody who wasn't a craftsman to make these objects just to start with. And then we go on to the next level. Is okay, then how come people have got these combs? What does that tell us about them? Well, me being a bit of a slaphead, as you can see on the video, Emily, I don't use a comb very often, but plenty of people do. And it shows that they were concerned about their physical appearance. But it also shows, because we know that the gaps on the teeth of the comb, some of them are further apart and some of them are closer together. Some of the combs are double-sided and resemble very much the knit combs that mums and dads will recognise from getting the knits out of their kids' hair. And some of the combs have their teeth very, very close together for getting those nasty little creatures out of the hair. Some of the gaps on the combs are further apart. And okay, this could be for combing hair, but also there's a strong evidence to suggest that the combs were part of the weaving process that were used on the looms to spread the threads. And we know that Anglo-Saxons made all their own clothes out of wool, out of linen. And so weaving was something which was part of everyday life. Many of the houses at Weststow show evidence of looms inside them. Some of the houses we think were lived in at Weststow at some parts of their lives. Other times during their period of existence, they were used just for working in. And when they got really old, the houses, we think that they may have been used for storage. So depending on the age of the houses, they may have been used for different things, but weaving was certainly a big part of what Anglo-Saxon life was about. Did the men do it? Did the women do it? Who knows? Maybe a mixture. But we found the combs, which could have been for personal use and for weaving. We've also found lots and lots of bone. They're called pin beaters. They're sort of like very, very fat pointers that are pointed at both ends. And they're used for sort of just sorting out the threads on a loom and batting them up. So again, more bits and pieces to do with weaving. We've also found pins that are for personal adornment, made out of bone, and they polish up very nicely to be a white colour, and they look very smart against a background of wool or linen. So it's the bone and antler items are fascinating, and they're in pretty good condition, even though often broken. But we also find things that are made out of iron, but of course they're often corroded. And anything made out of natural material like wood or leather is nearly always rotted away. So we're only getting a partial picture, but it gives us some clues as to what they're like. And on the back of these metal objects, like the brooches, we sometimes get imprints of the wool and linen that they wore that are bonded into the corrosion products. So that again gives us some clues about it. So yeah, we've got a little bit of an idea of what daily life was like. And most of the time, the people were farmers.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up the idea of gender roles, because I think from my brief history lessons as a child, it was, in the 90s, it was very much sort of the men were warriors and the women did the looming. But I was going to ask, is there actually any physical evidence of that, or could we be dealing with a society that's potentially a lot more progressive than our own?
Yes. I think the period that we're talking about is often called, as well as the Anglo-Saxon period, the period as a whole is often called the medieval period. And I think the things that you're saying are much truer of later on in the medieval period. than they are in this early period, because we've got quite a bit of evidence to suggest that Anglo-Saxon women could rise to the very top of the social hierarchy. Anglo-Saxon women could be queens. The Lady of the Mercians, she's a good example of an Anglo-Saxon queen. And it's also interesting that the early period is fundamentally pagan. We talked about their beliefs, but in the Middle Saxon period, we start getting the arrival of the Christian influence. And it's very interesting, Sutton Hoo shows this very well, that the new Christian missionaries, they quite often target the wives of kings, even if those kings are pagan. There's a recurring pattern that they seem to target the wives of kings and convert them to Christianity, and then get those wives to work on the kings themselves, and then the whole kingdom, if the king becomes Christian, the whole kingdom then follows his lead. And so you can see there, that's another indicator of the importance of women in society. Equally, the grave goods. We don't find weaponry and the like in Anglo-Saxon graves, but we do find these high status, massive brooches and very important beads and other items in there, which shows that these women certainly had status in the society. The exact, it's very difficult to have evidence from a period that doesn't write things down. In this early Anglo-Saxon period, all we're getting is oral messages from stories like Beowulf, as you mentioned, that are passed on verbally until eventually, ironically, it's the monks that write down the pagan stories that came before them. So yes, we do have plenty of indications that in Anglo-Saxon times, women had a pretty good status, and actually probably a higher status than evolved later on in medieval and post-medieval times, that they could own land in their own right, whereas later on, even much later times, when women married, all their possessions were moved immediately over to their husband. And this may not have been the case in Anglo-Saxon times, but we're still working on that. But there are lots of things to suggest that women in Anglo-Saxon time had a pretty decent social status and more rights than they did later on in history.
Nice.
You asked earlier on about animals, and the other, I'd mentioned briefly that animal bone was well preserved. Well, at West Stow, all or nearly all the animal bone was preserved. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of thousands of fragments of animal bone, which allowed the archaeologists to completely reconstruct the animal husbandry at West Stow. And in a nutshell, we know that they started off with pigs, and then they introduced sheep, and pigs are mainly for meat and bone. Sheep, of course, you need for wool. And eventually they moved on to cows and cattle, because with cattle you get a lot more leather, you get more bone, more meat, and you get, if you like, more for your money. But the interesting thing is, as you also touched on, at West Stow, the soil is not great. It's very sandy and it's not particularly rich. So at West Stow, we have evidence to suggest a massive animal husbandry system, but not a great deal of evidence to suggest crops. So maybe certain places like West Stow specialised in animals, which they then traded with other areas that had better soils that use crops as well. So it's animal husbandry. Yes, it was added to animal farming. Yes, they went out. We've got bones of animals they hunted, like deer and other animals. But it's essentially what we would call farming. And on the farming side as well, today we think, oh, well, you've got wheat and barley and sugar beet and various other root crops. But in Anglo-Saxon times, yes, they had some of those. But in addition, they harvested a lot of wild fruit and natural wild plants to add to their diet as well, that were naturally occurring. So it's a much wider diet than we're used to today.
Sounds yummy, to be honest. Do we have an idea of how long they lived for? Like what sort of age they were dying?
Yes, another cracking question from the Westo top 10 questions. Where do they go to the toilet is another one. I'm expecting that at some time. But yes, how old did they live? Well, we need to start by saying, when people say, well, the average age, remember the maths. All you need is the average age is calculated by taking the whole number of death evidence together and, of course, finding the average. Now, we know that in the past, a lot of people died either very young in their first year of life, or another danger time was when the women were giving birth to those children. In the days before antiseptics and the like, that was a hazardous time. So we've got a lot of deaths in the early part of life. But equally, we've got evidence for people who lived into their 60s. But because of this lot of deaths in the early period, it tends to drag the average age down to about 30. So it's correct to say the average age is in its 30s or mid 30s, but equally it's important to remember that that is slightly skewed by the fact that there are a lot of early deaths, and people could quite easily live to an older life. But of course, this is pre the NHS, and if you got something that was nasty, it probably would kill you as part of that. So a wide range of ages, but a lot of people died early.
So do you think, because this is a common one as well, if the average sort of death age is sort of my age, do you think that means I would have married a lot earlier? So what is their sort of marriage ritual, their sort of companionship? Were they sort of man, woman? Is there any evidence of relationships beyond that, perhaps LGBTQ? Or are we looking at the sort of what we traditionally think of in history of that sort of like the 12-year-old girl gets married to the 16-year-old boy and then she pops out a baby at 14?
Great question. Particularly as you've asked the question, which is perfectly okay, as a modern person.
Yeah.
And you put the LBG and everything else in there because those are current topics. 50 years ago, people wouldn't have added that into their question. And so inherent in your question is our modern view of what society could or should be like. Mm-hmm. The short answer to your question about relationships and what have you is we don't really know much, because they don't tell you that kind of thing in stories like Beowulf. Beowulf's not interested in social relationships that much. He's interested in battles, monsters and heroes. So it's very hard for us to get evidence about that kind of thing, about relationships. But there is always this tendency for us to assume, rightly or wrongly, that it's rather like us today. But whether it is or not, we don't really know. So that's a tricky one in terms of evidence. We don't really know what relations and relationships were like, whether it was... there's no evidence to suggest multiple wives or anything like that. But it's a very difficult area to answer on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fair. Do we know, you mentioned briefly about trading. So they would have these sort of, so they would say, let's say there's a village at Westow, and then we would assume perhaps there's a village in Essex. Would it be that they strike up trade relationships within the country? Were they more likely to go abroad to Europe to do that? And or is it more that they were sort of this idea that they were constantly at war with each other? Or is it like any period in history where one day they're at war and then the next day they strike a peace deal and trade sheep or whatever?
Yeah, very good concepts there again. Everybody always assumes that Westow village had a fence or a wall or a ditch around it. It didn't. And that is a big indicator. At this time, this early period, warfare was, not like World War II with Spitfires flying overhead, obviously, but warfare was done on a much smaller scale, much more. If you imagine things that you've seen about, let's take third world example like Africa, warfare in the main was going a little bit down the road and nicking a cow or two from the people who lived down there, and in quite often that was the nature of it in Anglo-Saxon times. And this part of the country, East Anglia, in the main, our evidence suggests that they were the ones who went out and did the nicking of cows, rather than the ones that got cows nicked off them. And there's not much evidence of fortifications. You know, warfare. When you get warfare, you get the evidence of weaponry and fortifications. And there's not much of that in this early period around here. Equally, an army officially in these early periods, a hera or army, is, 30 people is an army. 10 men armed to the teeth with spears, and some of them with swords, who know what they're doing, can quite easily dominate a village of, let's say, 30 people, or even 60 people easily, because they've got the weapons and they know how to use them, and 10 of them can do the job. So it's a much smaller scale than one might imagine. Also, you've got to remember that in this early period, the kingdoms themselves were going through this process of small kingdoms joining together to make ever bigger and bigger kingdoms. These kingdoms eventually became the 7 kingdoms, the East Angles, Wessex, Mercia, all these other kingdoms. But they're still in the process of getting small areas that were originally set up by the first settlers, growing and merging and joining with others, and hence the small scale. So getting back to the issue of trade, here at Weststow, Stanley West believed that this was a very densely settled part of the country. Within Weststow Country Park, which isn't very big, we have evidence for at least 2 Anglo-Saxon settlements next to the river. And Stanley believed that there were these little villages of a hall, possibly a hall and 6 or 7 houses, maybe 2 halls, each with 6 or 7 houses, creating a village. There were those things literally about every mile up the river, because the river was the main way that people moved around. And it's the way that the first settlers established their settlement, back to school, on a hill by a river, sital settlement work. So lots of communities close together, and they would trade with each community in a small scale. But at the same time, we've got fantastic evidence at Weststow from the pottery. Now, at Weststow, we found these pottery stamps. Guess what? Made out of bone and antler, well preserved. And these pottery stamps give us the patterns, and those patterns are like fingerprints. They are unique to the pot stamp that the potter used, and we can track them through wherever they're found. So the pottery lasts a long time, and on many of the pottery it's decorated. Some of it is plain, some of it is decorated, and these pot stamps show us where these pots were traded that were made at Weststow. And from that we've created a little map, and the archaeologists can tell us where they were. And we show that they were traded up and down the river, but quite long distances throughout East Anglia. We've got a network of them that travel 30, 40, 50 miles. So you've got the trading within the villages, just a mile. You've got trading that is 30, 40 or 50 miles. You've also got trading with other kingdoms, because we've got various items which are very much the style of, let's say, Saxon dominated areas. And then beyond that, we've got a much wider picture at Weststow. The most distant evidence we have is a cowrie shell, which is on display in the museum there, and they come from the Red Sea. So we know that glass, pieces of glass often are made, the main place for making glass was in the Rhineland area of Germany. So we know we've got some things that come from Europe, some things that come from the Mediterranean, and some things that come as far as the Red Sea. So we have got a pattern of local trading, trading within and beyond what we would call the county boundaries, within and beyond what we would call the country, and even further afield to Europe and beyond. So a well-established trading community.
Wow, that's so cool. What are the other most asked questions that I haven't asked yet?
Well, let's go mucky and go, where do they go to the toilet? The other thing to bear in mind about the Anglo-Saxons is wee and poo is a very valuable commodity in the past. We know that urine was collected for use in the dyeing process. That's not coming to the end of your life, but making things change colour. And the chemicals involved with urine were stored, the urine was kept and used as very much part of the dyeing process. Saxons weren't named because they walked around in sacks and were brown coloured, which is sometimes the kids come with that from schools. They loved colours, and we know that they did blue and a deep red and a yellow, bright yellow, were all commonly used colours. And again, the colours, the sophistication and the quality of the dye stuff also tells you the rank of the person that's wearing that. In those days, if you had it, you flaunted it, and everybody knew that you were a rich or important person. So the wee was kept and hoarded, and the poo we know throughout the medieval period. You were rightly pointing out that the soils around Westow are very sandy. The sands and gravels are very dry, very sandy, not brilliant for many crops that need more nutrients. How do you improve that? The answer is save all the animal and human poo that you can and chuck it on the fields. And we've got direct evidence from that in the little tiny pieces of pottery and what have you. And in the most recent excavations at Westow that took place in 2007-8, when we were building the latest visitor centre, there the modern archaeological technique showed that they'd actually stored masses of poo in an old Anglo-Saxon house pit, which they probably thought that was part of, the archaeologists think that was part of some sort of industrial process, either part of the tanning process that needs wee and poo to strip various things from the leather, or just for storage before they then spread it out on the fields. But it's an unusual thing today. That would be the last thing we do, is to save our wee and poo. But in those days, it was a very valuable resource. So that's one of the questions.
Very economical as well, that sort of idea of using everything.
Yes, the people who lived here were as green as you can imagine, a self-sufficient economy. If there'd have been a Holocaust, as some people argue there was, if you like, at the end of the Roman period, when plagues and social systems all broke down, the Anglo-Saxons were perfectly placed to take advantage of that. They could make their own fires. Could you make your own fires from
Absolutely
nothing at all?
not.
They had flint and steel. They knew how to make their own fires. They made their own houses. They made their own clothes. They made their own pottery. They hunted, fished, and farmed. Everything that they needed to do, they could do. They were a self-sufficient society, unlike us today, who would be hard pressed to do any of the things that I've just listed. The Romans, what did they ever do for us? Well, one of the things that the Romans did do was to start this idea that people all should be specialists. You had the roof tile maker, and that's all he ever did was make roof tiles. He couldn't do other things. He could just make roof tiles. The Anglo-Saxons were very different to that. They could do all sorts of things. Yes, they would have had certain people in the village who were better than other people at, let's say, knowing how to build a house, or let's say doing weaving, who you go to them to get their advice. But a lot of the people were good at many, many things. You had to be to survive in those days. You had to know how to grow crops, how to hunt animals, to gut animals, to get the most from every resource that was around you. And that, again, is a very different aspect of their lives as opposed to our lives today when we go to the supermarket or we watch it on the telly. Things were different.
Very different. And it's interesting as well that they chose to settle, and that with these transferable skills, if you will, popping CVs, they didn't lead nomadic lifestyles and keep I don't know, maybe they did. Would they send someone out and be like, is there like better water somewhere? Can you go check? And then we'll move our village over there. But it would have been so easy for them to just up and leave, which do you think would have made them safer in terms of like, oh, hey, there's a barbarian on the way, we should probably leave? They could just move aside. Or would they be like, no, this is our settlement, we'll defend it?
Yeah, the evidence suggests the latter of the two options that you've outlined there. It's fascinating at West Stow that what the archaeologists have told us is whilst the settlement itself did not move, because then you get the advantages of just following on from our last point, the Anglo-Saxons managed the landscape. They didn't just wait for things to happen. They managed the woodland and the field systems. They rotated the crops, all the things that you have to do. They require you to stay in one place to manage that. So whilst the village, as part of its economy, was static, the traders, of course, would have moved around. The people looking after the animals, we've evidence to suggest at West Stow that rather than have a fully developed field system, today you always think of animals living in fields. But today we know that more and more farmers are actually keeping, for example, pigs are a good example, in woodland, because there's more natural food and healthier food in woodland. And pigs are, for example, are some of the few animals that can eat acorns and other nuts that form. And so we believe that the Anglo-Saxons would have managed their animals and moved their animals around from woodland to high heathland to make the best of the seasonal food that was around. They wouldn't be able to go to the feed store and buy a bag of feed. It had to be what was around naturally, and they would have been fully aware of what parts of the countryside around them they would have needed to move their animals to in order to take advantage of that. But the village stayed the same. But within inside that village, we know that the actual houses moved around. Today, we think the lifespan of a house could be 100 years. Some houses that we know of have been around in that place and lived in for 500, maybe more years. In Anglo-Saxon times, these houses were made out of wood. And one of the things we found out about West Stow is you put a piece of wood in the ground and it rots straight away. Day one, it rots, or it starts the rotting process. So one of the things that we're trying to work out is how long will a house stand up without literally falling down? And the archaeologists have told us, we've got evidence that they did fix the houses. The things that tend to rot are the posts in particular. And we've got evidence that they've replaced the posts. And we've done that in some of the houses at West Stow. So we know we can make the houses last longer. But then it goes back to our old idea that we mentioned earlier, that when a house is new, great, let's move in, let's live in it. Everything is hunky-dory and smashing. Let's go in there. As the house gets older, the roof might need a bit of repair. The gaps in the planks, as the wood shrinks over time, you get a little bit more draft, and more animals tend to move into the house to try and make nests and things like that. So the house is less good. So maybe they'd use that for just working in. And eventually the house is literally dangerous and about to fall on your head. And you have to have big lumps of wood to stop it falling over and hold your shed up. So then it'd still be useful as a shed, but you wouldn't spend your time in there. So the archaeologists have plotted the way that the houses eventually fell down and are moved around the village, and so the halls. And so they've used that as part of the dating process to show that people actually lived at West Stow for 200 or more years. But during that time, the little clusters of a hall and a house, when a house fell down, let's say a family had a new marriage, let's call it a marriage, we don't know whether it was or not, but a new relationship shut up, they might need a new house for those people to live and for the family. So a new house would be built, and then the old house would gradually fall down. So you get a natural movement. So whilst the villages themselves did not move around, we get this unusual thing that the houses within the village reach the end of their lives and they fall down through natural causes as new houses are built. And so you get slight migrations of these family groups around the area, but only small distances, hundreds of yards, if that, rather than further.
Nice. And is there any sort of last thing that you've always wanted to talk about and no one's ever asked you?
No, I've always wanted to go back in a time machine and see whether what, for example, I say to you or archaeologists tell us is a load of rubbish or not, because the bottom line is we don't really know. It's just a guess made on guesswork. But the thing that I would love to find out is what happened at the end of Weststow, because you get this sudden break at Weststow, and in lots of other places. I used to work in a museum in Stevenage, and exactly the same thing happened there in early Anglo-Saxon times. You get what some people call the Middle Saxon shuffle. What happens is all these early pioneering pagan villages spread out wherever people wanted to live, normally next to rivers. A lot of those stop, literally stop, and there's no more evidence for them, dating evidence. The people seem to have moved to new settlements at Weststow. This is exactly what happened. The Middle Saxon Weststow, in the main, all the Middle Saxon pottery is found a mile down the road around Weststow Church, because in the Middle Saxon time, Christianity is coming in. We're getting writing for the first time. We're getting the kings converted, and the kings are using this new invention of writing and Christianity as a way to control their assets, control their kingdom. And they want their people to all be accountable and all be taxable for them, because that's how the bigger kingdom must function. It needs that money and those resources coming up from various parts. So you get this Middle Saxon shuffle where you get these new Middle Saxon settlements taking place. And interestingly, most modern settlements, modern Weststow, is based on the Middle Saxon Anglo-Saxon settlement rather than the early pagan one. So there you get this big change. But I often wonder whether there are miserable so-and-sos rather like me sitting in an old house at Weststow saying, well, you youngsters, get off down the road to that flaming Christian thing. Don't expect me to come down here. I'm staying here. I was born here. My parents were born here, and I'm staying here till the end of my days. So don't ask me to do this newfangled move down to them churches. They'll never catch on. You'll be back here before you know it. So that's what I would like to see, something like that on my journey back in time.
It would be great. I imagine it would smell awful.
Yeah.
Just really
to our modern noses. But that's another interesting thing that experiments have proved, like living in the past, that you don't need to wash your hair. You don't need to have a bath. If you don't do those things, believe it or not, give it 6 months and your hair will naturally become accustomed to it. You won't necessarily need a deodorant because your body will naturally come to a new balance, which it doesn't have today because we're washing all the time. And it's that sort of adjustment of our modern assumptions compared to the Anglo-Saxon times.
Mm-hmm. Amazing.
Tune in next week to hear more from Alan, as well as Tim and Philip from episode 4, as they all discuss the importance of Suffolk in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and Middle-earth. We also discuss the new finds at the Rendlesham site and find out what eventually happened to the Anglo-Saxons. All this and more in episode 5, part 3. Suffin About Suffolk is on Facebook at Suffin About Suffolk, Twitter at Suffin Suffolk, Instagram at Suffin About Suffolk, and on YouTube. If you enjoy the podcast, you can head to ko-fi.com/Suffin About Suffolk and show your support for the price of a cup of coffee. All links are in the description. All the music you heard today was composed by the Silburys. You can follow them on Twitter at SilburysThe and hear more of their music at www.thesilburys.com. For now, thanks for listening. Mind how you go.